Right. Hello and welcome back to Study Hall, everyone. All you lifelong learners and curious minds out there. Today, we're diving deep into something. Well, it might not seem all that thrilling at first glance, but trust me, it's important. We're talking about the updated terms of service for X. Yeah, the platform formerly known as Twitter. I know, terms of service. It doesn't exactly scream fun times ahead, right? But think about X for a second. It's not just another social media platform, is it? It's kind of woven into everything these days: news, politics, even global events. And with the whole ownership shakeup and that whole rebranding thing, well, those terms start to feel a bit more, shall we say, relevant.
Absolutely. X's evolution and its influence on how we communicate, and consume information really make it crucial to understand these terms, especially for us here in the UK.
Exactly. And just so we're all clear, we've actually got two versions of these terms to dig into. One for everyone outside the EU, and then another specifically tailored for those within the European Union, EFTA states, and us here in the United Kingdom. So let's jump right in and see what's changed, what's stayed the same, and what it all means for us, the users. Okay, first things first, let's address the elephant in the room, yeah? Advertising. Both versions of the terms are pretty upfront about it, to be fair. You're going to see ads on X. It's pretty much part of the deal, the price of entry for using their services. X, along with all their partners, those third-party providers and whatnot, they're going to be serving up those ads to you. Think of it like the price of admission to some sort of global town square.
Yeah.
Only instead of pounds and pence, you're paying with your attention.
It's that classic internet trade-off, isn't it? Free access in exchange for being part of the audience, the one that advertisers are all trying to reach.
All right, now this is where things get a bit more, well, serious. Both versions of these terms really emphasize user responsibility. And they don't just mean, being polite and all that, although that's obviously not a bad thing. They're talking about actual legal responsibility, real accountability for what you post and what you do on X.
Yeah.
You got to follow their rules. Yeah. The user agreement, all those incorporated policies, and of course the laws of the land, which for us means UK law.
This emphasis on user responsibility really highlights how our actions online, they actually have consequences in the real world, don't they? What we say and do on X can have legal ramifications, even if it feels like a laid-back, informal space.
Now let's move on to what you can't do on X, some no-nos, if you will. Scraping data without permission is a big one. So if you had dreams of building a bot to, say, analyze trends on X without their okay, you might want to rethink that. They're pretty protective of their data and how it's used.
This is a key point because it really shows the power dynamic at play. X controls all the data, and they're very clear about who can use it and how.
And when it comes to enforcing their rules, they've got a pretty hefty toolbox, I'd say. They can remove content, limit what people see of your posts. They can suspend or even terminate your account altogether. They can even, in some cases, take legal action if they think it's necessary. And here's something that might surprise some people. Just being inactive on your account for too long, any potential legal risks they think you pose for the company, or even if they just think your account isn't commercially viable anymore, that's it. They can show you the digital door.
It really underscores the power imbalance, doesn't it, between the platform and the individual user. X has a lot of control, and it's important that users know that.
All right, let's get into something a little more complex. Intellectual property. You hear that phrase a lot these days, right? You own your content when it comes to social media. And on the surface, that seems true with X too. You keep the copyright to your tweets, your clever jokes, your photos, anything like that. But here's the thing. When you put that content on X, you're giving them a very, very broad license to use it. They can basically do what they want with it. Copy it, modify it, distribute it, pretty much anything, all without paying you a penny.
This is a classic example of how these platforms actually leverage the content we all create. They get to use it for their own benefit. We technically keep copyright, but X has the rights to do a lot with it.
And they justify this by saying, well, you're getting enough value by using the platform for free, aren't you? You get exposure, you might reach a large audience and a chance to connect with others. But it does make you think about ownership and control a bit differently, don't you think?
Absolutely. It's a complicated issue, and it has implications that go way beyond X.
Now, let's flip things around for a moment. While you're granting X a license to your content, they're also licensing their software to you. But there's a big caveat here. You can only use their software to, well, use their services. That means no messing with the code, no trying to sell it to someone else, no claiming you came up with it yourself.
It's a very, very specific and limited license, and it's designed to protect X's intellectual property while allowing users to access the platform.
And here's the part where X essentially says, look, you're using this platform at your own risk, okay? They offer their services as is and as available. No guarantees about it being perfect, no guarantees about security, or even that it'll be up and running all the time. They even specifically say that you might bump into content that's offensive or harmful. And their stance is, well, that's not really their problem.
That, as is disclaimer, it's a very common legal tactic to limit liability. But I will say, platforms are facing more and more pressure to take responsibility for the content they host. So that whole debate about accountability is ongoing and, well, constantly evolving.
Okay, let's imagine you've had enough of X. You're done, you want to deactivate your account. The good news is that's completely your right. You can end the agreement anytime you want. But let's say you feel like X has, I don't know, done you wrong somehow. What then? Do you have any legal recourse? Well, it's a bit complicated. You might have some legal options, but X's liability is capped. So in most cases, the most you could hope to get back is $100, or the amount you paid them in the last 6 months, which, let's be honest, is probably nothing.
This limited liability clause, it's very important. It protects them from significant financial losses.
And this is where things get a little more interesting for us in the UK. Since we're still under the European Union's umbrella, we have a few extra protections thanks to something called Digital Services Act. This basically means we have a right to challenge certain decisions made by X, giving us a little more say than users in other parts of the world. So it's not totally one-sided, at least for those of us under EU jurisdiction.
These EU regulations, they're designed to create a more balanced online environment and give users ways to fight back against unfair decisions. So it's definitely a positive step towards making these platforms accountable.
Of course, like all online platforms, X has an age limit. You've got to be at least 13 years old to use their services. Probably not a controversial rule, but it's worth mentioning for anyone out there with younger siblings who might be tempted to join the Xverse, right? And to make things just a little bit more complex, both sets of terms refer to a whole bunch of other policies. Their privacy policy, rules, and policies. It's like a bottomless pit of legal documents, to be honest.
This is why it's crucial to be aware of how all these terms and policies are connected. They all work together to govern what happens to users on X.
Then there's the whole thing with content removal. X has the power to take down anything that goes against their user agreement. They can even refuse to let content be distributed, limit how visible it is, suspend users, and even take back usernames, all without any liability. They have a lot of power when it comes to what stays and what goes.
And this highlights X's role as, well, a content moderator, which is not an easy job. They have to balance free speech with the need to tackle harmful content. Their decisions about what stays up and what's removed, well, they're often controversial, and they get criticized no matter what they do.
Okay, so we've covered quite a bit here, haven't we? User responsibility, the power X has to enforce those rules, that licensing agreement, limited liability, and some specific protections for us in the UK, thanks to the EU. It's a lot to take in, but honestly, I think it's essential information for anyone who uses this platform. What are your thoughts so far? Anything that particularly jumps out at you?
I think for me, what's most striking is the tension between user freedom and platform control. While we do have some rights and protections, the reality is that X has a lot of power, but understanding these terms can help us, the users, navigate that dynamic a bit more effectively.
That's a great point. Makes you really think about the trade-offs involved, doesn't it, when we use these kinds of platforms? Speaking of trade-offs, let's look at a specific example, something that might resonate with a lot of people in the UK.
I'm all ears. Lay it on me.
Okay, imagine a talented musician right here in the UK who's just recorded a brand new song. They're eager to share it with the world, and, well, X seems like the perfect platform to do that. But before they click that post button, let's think about what those terms of service really mean for them and their work.
That's a great example. Let's delve into that in the next segment.
Sounds good. We'll be back in a bit to explore how these terms could impact your rights as a creator on X. Don't go anywhere. Right then, let's get back to our case study, shall we? We've got our hypothetical UK musician, fresh track recorded, ready to unleash their musical masterpiece upon the world, all thanks to X. So, what happens next?
Well, as soon as that song hits the platform, they're basically stepping right into that licensing agreement we talked about earlier. Remember, they still technically own the copyright. The song is still theirs. But they've also given X a license to use it. And that license is, well, let's just say it's pretty broad.
So in real terms then, what does that mean for our musician? Could X, for instance, just take their song and use it in an ad campaign for something completely at odds with, I don't know, their values, like a fast fashion brand, something they might be ethically opposed to?
It's definitely possible. That license they've agreed to allows X to use the content for a wide range of purposes, even commercial ones, and they wouldn't need to ask for permission or pay royalties or anything like that.
Hang on a minute, that doesn't sound right, does it?
Mm.
Our musicians poured their heart into this song, and X could just profit from it without any obligation to them.
You've hit on one of the big issues in the digital world, haven't you? That balance of power, platforms versus creators. Users might hold the copyright, but the terms often give these platforms a lot of freedom to use that content however they want.
So what can our musician do? Are they just stuck with this agreement? No way out.
Well, it's not completely hopeless. There have been some cases where creators have managed to challenge platforms over the use of their content, particularly when it comes to obvious commercialization. But it's complicated, legally speaking, and the outcomes really depend on the specific situation.
So it sounds like our musician needs to be extra careful, really read those terms before posting their song on X.
Definitely. Being informed is key, isn't it? It's also worth thinking about using different platforms, ones that have licensing agreements that are more favorable to creators. There's a real movement growing towards platforms that put creators first and actually share revenue with them.
Okay, let's change gears a bit and think about another aspect of those terms that could affect our UK musician: content moderation. What if their song accidentally includes a sample that, without them knowing, infringes on someone else's copyright?
That happens a lot, actually. It really highlights why it's so important to understand copyright law and how fair use works. X has the right to remove content that violates copyright. They could take action against the musician even if it was an honest mistake.
So they could have their song taken down, account penalized, all because of a sample they didn't even realize was a problem. That seems a bit harsh, doesn't it?
It just goes to show how important it is to do your homework. Creators need to be incredibly careful about where they get their samples from and make sure they have all the right permissions. Platforms are under pressure, too, to develop better ways to detect copyright infringements and to educate users about their responsibilities.
Right, so let's say our musician manages to avoid any copyright issues and their song starts to gain traction on X. But then, let's say they get into a bit of a heated debate with another user in the comments. Things get a bit, shall we say, out of hand. Could X actually hold them responsible for what they said, even if it was just in the heat of the moment?
You remember how we were talking about user responsibility? Well, that applies here too. X's terms are very clear. Users are responsible for everything they post, no matter what.
So even if the musician argues that they were just caught up in the back and forth of online debate, X could still take action.
Exactly. They could remove the comments, issue a warning, even suspend the account for a while. It's important to remember that everything we do online is still subject to the law.
Right. Freedom of speech doesn't mean you can say whatever you want without consequences. Our musician might think they're just expressing an opinion. But if it crosses the line into harassment or hate speech, they could face real legal consequences beyond anything X might do.
Exactly. And here in the UK, those consequences would fall under UK law, which has specific laws about online harassment and hate speech.
All right, so we've looked at how these terms of service can affect creators on X, haven't we? From the licensing, content moderation, even the legal limits of what you can say online. It's a lot to think about, but I think it's really important for anyone who uses X to share their creative work, express their opinions, or even just participate in debates.
Absolutely. It's about being an informed and responsible user. These platforms offer amazing opportunities to connect with others and be creative, but they also come with responsibilities and potential risks.
Now, I want to shift our focus a bit. Let's think about those of us who mainly use X to consume content. We're always scrolling through our feeds, liking and retweeting, taking in all sorts of information. But how much do we actually know about the things that shape what we see and how we interact with this platform?
That's a great question. A lot of the time, we just use these platforms without really thinking about the algorithms, the data collection, all the things going on behind the scenes that are subtly influencing us.
Right. Let's peek behind the curtain a bit, shall we? Let's see how those terms of service give us a glimpse into the inner workings of X, especially for us here in the UK under EU regulations.
Sounds good. Let's dive in.
So we're back, and we've spent this deep dive really getting into the nitty-gritty of X's updated terms of service. But before we wrap things up, I want to shift gears a bit and think about those of us who mainly use X to Well, take in content, I mean, let's be honest, we're constantly bombarded with all sorts of tweets, trends, and news snippets, aren't we? But do we really understand what's going on behind the scenes? How is X actually shaping our online experience without us even realizing it?
Well, that's where those terms of service can actually be quite insightful, especially for us in the UK, because we're still under those EU regulations.
Exactly. So let's break down a few points that might surprise some people, shall we? Right, first up, let's talk about those personalized content recommendations. You know, the ones that just sort of magically pop up in your For You feed, and they seem to know exactly what you're interested in. Well, for EU users like us, X has to be a bit more transparent about how those recommendations actually work. They've got to tell us that those suggestions are based on how we use the platform, what we like, retweet, comment on, that sort of thing.
Right. It's all about engagement, isn't it?
Exactly. They also look at, well, the topics we've shown interest in and what other users with similar tastes are, looking at and interacting with.
It makes sense in a way.
So it's not just some random algorithm checking stuff at us. It's a very complex system designed to keep us scrolling, keep us engaged, keep us coming back for more.
And this level of transparency is good, right? It gives users more control over what they see.
Absolutely. And speaking of control, those terms also mention that we can actually adjust our settings to personalize those recommendations.
Oh, right. I think I've seen that.
Yeah, so if you're getting a bit overwhelmed by a certain topic, or you're tired of seeing the same types of tweets over and over, you can actually tweak those settings to refine what you see.
That's handy.
Now, let's talk about something we touched on earlier, data scraping. X is incredibly protective of its data, and for good reason, it's valuable stuff. But the terms also reveal something interesting. There are actually limits to how much data we can access, even if we're just regular users.
Oh, really?
Yeah. For example, both the US and the EU versions of the terms state that if you try to access more than 1 million posts in a 24-hour period, well, you're going to be hit with a hefty fine.
Wow. 1 million posts. That's a lot.
We're talking liquidated damages of $15,000 in the US and $15,000 for us here in the EU for every 1 million posts you go over that limit. It's like a digital speeding ticket for data enthusiasts.
That's pretty serious then.
It shows that X is really serious about protecting its data and preventing what they call excessive scraping, which can put a lot of strain on their systems.
And it shows how much they value that data, right?
Exactly. It's not just about stopping people from abusing the system. It's about protecting a core asset.
Mm.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into X's updated terms of service, I think the biggest takeaway is this. These terms, they're not just some legal mumbo-jumbo that we can ignore. They actually offer a glimpse into how things work behind the scenes. The power dynamics, the algorithms, all those data-driven decisions that shape our experience.
It's about being aware, isn't it?
And as users, whether we're creating content or just consuming it, I think it's so important to be aware of these things and understand how they impact us.
It's about being more than just a passive user, right? It's
Yeah.
about being informed and understanding what's really going on.
Well said. And on that note, I want to leave you all with something to think about. Now that you're more aware of what's in X's terms of service, how will you approach your interactions on the platform? Will you be more careful about the data you share, the content you're taking in, the way those algorithms are shaping your experience? It's something to think about, isn't it? We encourage all of you to consider these questions and, well, keep exploring the complexities of the digital world. That's it for this deep dive into the X terms of service. We hope you found it informative and maybe even a little bit entertaining. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and as always, keep learning.